Good morning, 250. Hope you guys are having a wonderful day. This is going to be a very short presentation on the rubrics that are used to measure teacher effectiveness in the state of Louisiana. So there are two different rubrics that are used in the state, NIET rubric and the Compass rubric. And depending on what school you take your first job at, it will be one of these two rubrics. Most schools are going to use Compass, with only a few using NIET. However, when you are doing your residency, we faculty members will be mandated to evaluate you based on the NIET rubric. So let's talk about that one first. So what is that? That is the National Institute for Excellence in Teaching. It is again, national rubric, and it is what Nicholls State has adopted for residency evaluations. So this rubric is also used by schools that are in a program called TAP. And if you go around when you're doing your observations for different classes, you will see signs up at some schools that distinguish them as a TAP school. So in this rubric, there are four major domains or areas that are evaluated. Your instruction will be evaluated, your learning environment, your design and planning of instruction, and your professionalism. So let's look a little bit more into these four areas. So when we talk about instruction, that is what the observer will see during your teaching. And you can see that these 12 areas are very distinctive. When you see the rubric, and in 250, you will get a copy of this rubric that will be laminated and easy to carry around, that you can carry it around to all of your upcoming classes. And then in each of your classes, you'll be looking further into these 12 areas of instruction. In the second area of environment, that's where observers are looking at your classroom management. So in Ed 313, which you'll take probably next semester, my secondary people will actually take that during their first semester of residency. That's where you will be evaluated on these parts of the rubric. Your planning instruction will come during Ed 312, which some of you are in now. Most of you will be taking next semester. And then your professionalism, we actually already talked about a bit in 250. So how are you measured with this rubric? So for each of these things, you will be measured on a scale of 5 to 1. So 5 is exemplary. There are very, very, very few, even veteran teachers, that will score 5 on the NIET rubric. 3 is proficient, and that is what we are aiming for during residency. By introducing this rubric through all of your classes, we're hoping that by the time you get to residency, you know all of these little tips and tricks that will score you as proficient on the NIET rubric. And again, 1 will be unsatisfactory. And there's 4 and 2 in between there, and we'll talk about each one as we go through each indicator. So in Ed 250, we're only looking at 4 parts of the rubric. Again, you'll get a copy of the whole thing. It will be overwhelming, but I've tried to color code it so that you are aware that we're only looking at 4 of these things in Ed 250. So in here, we're looking under instructions, number 1, standards and objectives, and that's what we're going to get to first. Then we are going to look at teacher knowledge of students. That's number 10 under instruction. Then we will look at professionalism. And then our last one, we're going to look at assessment. Last class, we talked very, very briefly about assessment, and we talked about assessment during instruction versus assessment after instruction. Do y'all remember what those two were called? Give you a second to think about that. Assessment during instruction is called formative assessment. And then assessment after instruction, such as tests, projects, exit tickets, that's called summative assessment. But when we go into assessment, we'll go much, much deeper into that. Okay, so the second rubric that we are going to talk about this semester and that you need to learn about is called the compass rubric. And what I want to emphasize right now is that although there are two different rubrics that you have to look at and potentially be assessed with during your teaching, they're very, very similar. They're going to look at the same things, and we will see an alignment guide to where you can really see where the indicators on the NIET rubric fall on Compass and vice versa. But for right now, you just need to know that there are two rubrics that are used in Louisiana. The first, again, was NIET, and the second is Compass. Compass will be used at all Louisiana schools that are non-TAP schools, and it really tries to evaluate the teacher, excuse that pop-up, evaluate the teacher based on student learning goals and how students are learning and really grasping the standards and the objectives for the lesson. Okay, so how are the results of Compass used? And honestly, this is for both rubrics. The results of any kind of teacher evaluation while you are in the field, this will emphasize and impact your hiring, your placement. In some school districts, it is linked to raises and bonuses for compensation. It is linked to retention, promotion, and tenure at some schools. And it's also linked to certification, meaning that your initial certification in the state of Louisiana is a temporary 3-year certification. And doing well on these rubric evaluations, whether they're NIET or Compass, will help with your permanent certification in the state of Louisiana. Okay, so the main difference between NIET and Compass is that Compass has two very distinct parts to it. So the first is student growth, and those are measured by SLTs, student learning targets, and we're going to talk about those in just a minute. And the other is your professional practice. That's more like the NIET rubric. Again, excuse those pop-ups, sorry. And that is with formal or informal observations. So let's talk about first the SLTs. Going back here, if you look, kind of picture this as a Venn diagram. So your two circles, two parts of your evaluation for Compass. One is the student growth with SLTs. One is your observations, much like the NIET rubrics. So that circle that is student growth is based on two SLTs. So as a teacher, you'll work with your mentor, you'll work with your teacher coach, you'll work with your administration, and you will develop two SLTs for each school year. The important part of these, kind of think of them as objectives for your students. Just like objectives, they have to be measurable. So you can't say that students will develop a cultural awareness for music in the arts, because you can't really measure that. But if you can say that the students will increase their knowledge of math by 2% throughout the school year, and you can measure that with standardized test scores to make sure that they are growing by at least 2%. So you have to be measurable. They have to be based on some type of student learning data, usually that's standardized test scores, and they have to be aligned to our standards. And then the second part, if we were talking about that Venn diagram and those circles, is professional practice. So that is much like the NIET rubric, and we're talking about 2 observations per year, and you are scored on 5 different areas: setting outcomes, managing classroom procedures, that's your classroom management again, using questioning and discussion techniques, engaging students in learning, and using assessment and instruction. You're scored 1 to 4 on Compass. So if you go ahead and look at these 5 components, I'll give you a second just to read over those one more time. And I want to go back to our NIET rubric. Look at these indicators right here. they're really very, very similar to these 5 components. In my opinion, the NIET are just broken down a bit more. But these ideas of setting outcomes, that's your objectives, procedures, that's your classroom management, questioning and discussion techniques, that is your actual instruction, engaging your students, that's also in the NIET rubric, and using those assessment techniques. So you'll see that the professional practice circle of Compass, remember the other circle is those SLTs, the 2 student learning targets that you set for your students. So the professional practice is really a whole lot like the NIET rubric. Okay, so let's go back and just kind of sum this up. What I wanted to do here, I wanted to show you that there are 2 rubrics that you possibly can be evaluated on as a Louisiana teacher. I wanted to show you that the NIET rubric has 4 very broad areas that are evaluated: instruction, environment, planning, and professionalism. I wanted to tell you that these are measured at 1 to 5, and even though we all want to try to do our very best and aim for that 5, as a resident, you're really aiming for that 3. You're aiming for that proficient. And I also wanted to tell you that we're only looking at 4 of these areas in Ed 250, and that this is the rubric that you will be evaluated on during residency. This is the rubric, the NIET, not the Compass, for during residency. Okay, and then the other rubric that I introduced you to is called the Compass rubric. And the main difference between Compass and NIET is that Compass has 2 distinct parts to it. It has that observation piece, just like NIET, that is called the professional practice during Compass. But then it also has a student growth component to it. And that is where you and your team and your administration set 2 specific learning targets for your students for the entire year. They need to be measurable, they need to be based on student learning data, and they need to be aligned to the state standards. So besides that, we really want to see that these 2 rubrics are very similar. The biggest distinction is that Compass has that circle of student learning targets and not just the observation, and that all of this is based on good instruction. I hope that helped. Let me know if you have any questions, and I hope you guys have a wonderful day.